Good day, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about what we should do when, well, if, but it looks like when, Pope Francis lays the hammer down on the traditional Latin Mass even more than he already has. Rumor has it that April 3rd is going to be sort of a day that will live in infamy, wherein there will be a much harsher crackdown of the traditional Latin Mass, and this may be the case just in time for Holy Week. Things like this have happened before. But it's not all despair and hopelessness, because there are solutions in how to weather this storm of this attack on tradition. We're going to go over 7 solutions to surviving the Latin Mass ban if it does come to pass. And even if it doesn't, it could be the case that at some point you have to move, or maybe just in your diocese, there's a restriction, but it's not necessarily from Pope Francis, but you have to figure out a solution. And people talk to me all the time and they say, Kennedy, what can I do to survive, without tradition? What can I do to survive if all I have is a Novus Ordo around? Well, here are some examples that we're going to go through. First thing I got to say, though, is this is assuming you're not going to go to the new Mass. I will not participate in the new Mass, and I definitely won't make it my regular pit stop for my family. So these are things I've had to think about. Luckily, I have the Society of St. Pius X around here and growing, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Canada is, in some ways, an undesirable place to be for certain reasons, but for reasons of tradition, if you live in certain spots, you can actually have a pretty good situation. I'm very, very blessed and thankful to the priests of the SSPX every day. However, there are situations wherein this is not the case for some people. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of why you would choose not to attend the Novus Ordo in this video. I've done that in other videos, but needless to say, if you're here and you've made that decision, you kind of know what I'm talking about. And I am going to do another video soon. I just haven't been able to find the time to make a script for it yet, about how you actually have a right to the traditional Latin Mass that is based in the natural law, the divine law, even Vatican II, and of course many magisterial documents before the Second Vatican Council. So it's actually pretty deep, and there's nothing that the Church can do to take that right away from you. Anyway, all right. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Latin Mass ban 7 solutions. So we're going to go through these numbers 1 through 7. Number 1. The Society of St. Pius X. Well, this is pretty obvious. If you have a Society of St. Pius X near you, even if you don't go to the SSPX, well, here's your chance. It's all pro as far as what matters. The cons involved in attending the Society of St. Pius X are essentially the fact that people will disown you, call you a schismatic. Not everybody, but some people. A lot of people get super judgmental. They'll call you names, stop being your friend, etc. This has happened. Sadly, I mean, the people who dislike tradition are so unbelievably charitable that they need to basically castigate and excommunicate people from their lives for going to Mass at a different building than them. So that just kind of shows you, what side you're on. Society of St. Pius X is the first option. There are many places, tradition is in some ways kind of like the Starbucks coffee model. What do I mean by that? Well, there was this idea that if you had a coffee shop already on a corner in downtown or wherever you are, that people didn't want to dare put another coffee shop in the same area because they thought that, they wouldn't get any business. But Starbucks, this is how the sort of urban legend goes. Maybe it's true. The principle is true behind it. But the idea was, well, Starbucks would see that there was already a desire for a coffee shop, so they'd actually open up another coffee shop across the road. And then what happened is in fact, both places did better because it sort of became a hub for good coffee. And you actually find this in business. There's a reason why, in a city with a restaurant district, there'll just be tons of restaurants in a row because it actually does help. People have restaurants on the mind and they go there and everyone is well served. What does this have to do with tradition? Well, it is often the case that, if there is a SSPX in an area or a strong traditional Latin Mass community or some other traditional order, there will often be a fraternity parish or a society parish or a Christ the King or TLM thing kind of nearby, kind of within very close driving distance, because what is seen there is that there's usually a bishop who's pretty okay with tradition, and there's also a need for it. There's a desire for it. People have tradition on the mind. It's kind of like that Starbucks coffee model. So if you do live in a place with the fraternity or Christ the King or a traditional Latin Mass community, it's very likely that the SPX is not going to be too far away. Even here in Canada, if I think of all the places in Ontario where there's traditional Latin Mass communities, there's not that many of them, but wherever they are, I mean, you could drive within an hour, hour and a half in pretty much any direction, and you'd be able to find an SSPX chapel with Sunday Mass, I think, pretty much no matter what, unless you live somewhere basically in the sticks in the middle of nowhere, which there's probably not even any churches around there. So that's something to think about. The Society of St. Pius X. That's option number 1. Option number 2, clandestine or independent. Now, this one is a little bit controversial for some reasons that are understandable. The pros of this, clearly, the pros of this and the pro and cons list is that you have the traditional Latin Mass. I've never been to a clandestine. Well, sorry, I should make a distinction here. Clandestine, what does that mean? Well, maybe a bishop takes away the traditional Latin Mass in an area, and a retired priest says, if you happen to show up at my house or whatever, or you show up at your friend's house, or you show up at so-and-so's private chapel, I'll be saying Mass, and if you're there, I'll just happen to give you Holy Communion. Clandestine, private, whatever you want to call it. This was really common during the lockdowns. A lot of people did this. And just so everybody knows, there's a long history in the church of traveling priests, for example, doing Mass when they're traveling. This is not something that you need to have major faculties for. That's really a kind of a misconception people have. In fact, this even happens in the Novus Ordo. So-and-so is on vacation, a priest, and he's with his family, and he just says Mass at the cottage for his family. I mean, this is something that this is what a private Mass is. There's nothing. People can't call you a schismatic for this. So clandestine, private, secret, whatever, Mass on the down low, whatever you want to call it. These things happen all the time, even not in times of crisis, and even with non-traditional priests. So this is actually a pretty safe option as far as that's concerned. Now, as far as the difference between a clandestine and independent Mass, so the reason I put them on the same slide, they're similar but different. An independent Mass, I've never been to one, but there are various priests who sort of have their independent chapels. Now, admittedly, it is more difficult to justify to some people, basically, how could a priest just have an independent chapel? Personally, I think we're in a time of crisis, a grave crisis in the church, and although I don't think that independent chapels are a way forward or desirable, I would say that, canon law is very clear that you can approach any priest for the needs of the sacraments and so forth, which would include, confession, Mass, and so on and so forth. And there have been traditional independent chapels operating all around. I wouldn't say that it's schismatic, and I just wouldn't say that. And I would say that the only reason these chapels exist is because of the need. So that's worth considering. Although people would have to do their homework about what the priest himself believes. There are some crazy situations out there where there's like actual charlatans or invalid priests doing weird things. It's a weird world out there. But there definitely are some independent chapels that a lot of people have gone to for years. There you go. So that's one of the options as well. And I would say one of the major downfalls, though, is, when you do this whole idea of clandestine or private Masses, the thing is you're going to be in, basements and garages and things like that. And on the one hand, when we were in lockdown and we were doing that sort of thing, it was actually quite a wonderful lesson for our children about how important the faith is. It's like, hey, if the government's going to shut down the most important thing and leave open, strip clubs and abortion clinics and whatever, we're going to prove that the most important thing is the faith. and we're going to actually do what it takes. So on the one hand, that can be good. On the other hand, though, it's not a long-term solution. I mean, you don't want to be going to an independent mass somewhere in an undesirable location, because it's just, I mean, that's just a way to very much isolate yourself, and not in a good way. I mean, obviously we want to sort of say no to some of the things in the world, but at the same time, making it feel like going to mass is some sort of punishment, or I don't know, obscure thing that nobody else does. And it seems to me like that wouldn't be an ideal way to raise a family, although it's a temporary measure, if that makes sense, And we're going to get to what would happen perhaps with other options as well. So, okay, this option, the Eastern Rite. Now, admittedly, I have never been to a Byzantine liturgy or a Syriac or anything like that. I have no experience personally with the Eastern liturgies. So I want to give a little proviso here. I'm not saying that the East is traditional, because even though the Eastern liturgies are traditional, it is clear when you look into what some of the Eastern Catholic priests, and you can find this all over YouTube shows and stuff, believe, many of them are modernists or are infected by liberalism. It's probably better than the Novus Ordo, because I think that definitely the traditional liturgies of the East at least imbibe in the priest, obviously, traditional Catholic belief and principles. However, the theological framework that you find in a lot of the ways that these Eastern Catholic priests are talking, it's not as if it's some haven for traditional Catholicism. Far from it. However, the liturgy is, there are some communities where the Eastern liturgies have basically become the Novus Ordo in a different language, sadly. I think the Chaldeans are suffering with that right now, as far as I've been told. However, there's lots of Byzantines and other rites where it seems to be very traditional still. At least in that situation, if you go to Mass, you are just going to what is clearly a Catholic Mass, and the lex orandi, lex credendi of the Church, this idea of the law of prayer and law of belief, how things are prayed is what you will believe. It is clear that you're going to Catholicism. It's not going to be some sort of Protestant hybrid. It's clear that the Mass is a sacrifice. I have friends who go to the Eastern liturgies, and even though it's not all sunshine and rainbows when it comes to the theology necessarily that you might hear here and there in sermons, although it's not really that bad, maybe the priests aren't necessarily traditional, but because the actual framework is so traditional, all of the ceremonies, the liturgy, the chanting, everything, it's just clearly beautiful and Catholic, and that's amazing. And this is, it's a wonderful aspect of the Church, is having the Eastern liturgies, for the many millions of Eastern Catholics out there. This is part of the Church's patrimony, and we should celebrate this. So there are some pros to it, but there are some cons. To be honest, one of the big pros is that, they can't call you a schismatic if you're going to this. I mean, this is one thing. I mean, hey, if you're in a town and you're going to the traditional Latin Mass and there's an Eastern Catholic liturgy parish, whatever, around, this is a very tempting option, because as I said, if you start to go into the SSPX or something like that, people will, get real charitable, and they'll show you how charitable they are by never talking to you again, etc. I've been on the end of this. Anyone who goes to the SSPX knows this is the case. So, that's a very big pro. I mean, you can, in some sense, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, I guess. This is no indictment on the East. I'm just saying, from the aspect of community and social life, that's something to consider. Now, however, though, if you're not Eastern, this is why, I really can't stand these arguments from a lot of these Vatican II Novus Ordo apologists that, well, hey, all these things, we find these things in the East, and that's okay that they brought them over to the Roman liturgy. No, the liturgy should never mix. And the East would say this as well. In fact, the East, they hate Latinization. And good on you, Easterns. I hate that your liturgy will be Latinized, and I don't want mine to be Byzantinized or Easternized. Not because there's anything wrong with either one, but because they're fundamentally different realities. There's a reason why. Look at the way that Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox saints and philosophers and theologians just speak about reality and compare that to the West. We're talking in some ways about completely categorically different ways of presenting even just fundamental philosophical concepts. That's not to say that the East is incorrect. All it is to say is it's like a different language. Not just the language you speak, but an actual language of thought. And that's fine. Clearly, there are many Eastern Catholic saints, and they're just as holy as the next one. This is not about, the whether or not it works. What I'm saying is you just aren't that. If you're not Eastern, you're just not Eastern. And it's a massive culture shock. And a lot of the time there's sort of an ethnic reality to Eastern Catholic parishes and things like that. And if you're not, you're just some, what do they call them? Heinz 57, you're like a mutt, a North American mutt, sort of Anglo-Saxon background mixed with German, Scottish, and a little bit of, Indian or whatever, 6 generations back, and you've never once done anything Ukrainian in your life except for maybe eat some food here and there. Or maybe you were fooled by Zelensky for a bit and put a silly little avatar on your profile picture. You're going to be going to a different universe, a different liturgical universe, a different theological expression. And they're beautiful. But if that's not what you are, then it's not what you are. Okay. And again, this goes both ways. I would not want an Eastern Catholic who is in his heart of hearts in love with Eastern Catholicism and has been his whole life, and it's his culture and it's his ethnicity, all sorts of things. I would not want him to be forced away from that. It wouldn't be fair to him, and he has a right to his heritage and his patrimony. And the same thing is true in the West. So the Eastern Catholic option is a really great option in a lot of ways. Again, for all the reasons we said. But there are realities to consider that make it difficult for Western, Latin, Roman Rite Catholics. So there's another option to consider, and there are pros and cons for that. Now, this is not a solution, but I always forget to do the advertisements. Got to keep the lights on, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I'd like to show you our sacred frankincense oil. See? Go, sacred frankincense. I'm going to tell you a quick story about this. So we actually procured frankincense oil from the Middle East, from Oman, and it is rumored that this is the same region that the 3 wise men or the kings would have found the frankincense they brought to Christ. This is not a matter of dogma. I'm not saying that this is something you have to believe in order to be saved, but it is an interesting story, and if it is true, then that's pretty great. So please click the links in the description for the TKR store. We also have lanolin balm, straight from Australia. We got some pure lanolin balm. It's an amazing ointment, etc. I use it with my kids when they get bumps and scrapes. I use it when my hands get cracked in the winter. In fact, if you spend a lot of time praying the rosary, which you should, or if you're Eastern, maybe something else, the tchotchke or whatever it's called, the chotki, and you're on your knees a lot, you might actually get cracked knees from your calluses. That does happen to Catholics, and that's a sign that you're doing the right thing. And this stuff helps as well. Okay, if you're into these sort of natural health products and cosmetic products, these things work really well for reasons of sort of immune system health, etc. Even just the ability to have beautiful smelling things like frankincense in your house. There's a reason why Christ was brought frankincense. It's a very special gift fit for a king. So if you'd like to learn more about that, please click the links in the description and visit the TKR store. All right. So what about the next option? Here is sort of tongue in cheek. If your Latin Mass is canceled, then be prepared to drive far. I just want to let's expand on this a little bit. So listen, the church does not expect you to do what is impossible, and that includes for both physical and moral reasons. So you'll find, for example, in canon law, that it might be morally impossible for you to approach a Catholic minister, which it's just not really defined. It's something you have to sort of decide for yourself. So if it's morally impossible for you to go to the parish in your town, that is a Novus Ordo parish or whatever, then it is what it is. That's your decision, and nobody else can make that for you. That being the case, in a sense, you're dispensed from attending there. That's kind of what that means. So then what you have to do there is you still have to sanctify Sunday somehow. And how are you going to do that? Well, if you have to drive 2 hours to go to traditional Latin Mass, you can make that decision. And if you want to do that, there are pros to that. And one of the pros is the fact that you're going to go to traditional Latin Mass. And, I have to believe that if you're going to put the effort in because you are convinced that, God ought to be worshipped in the right way that is due to his majesty, and this is your right as a Catholic and all these sorts of things, and you're actually going to put in a lot of effort and spend a lot of money on gas to do that, I have to believe that, you give God some loaves and fishes and he gives you back in abundance. I think this is something where God will bless your family for making decisions like that. We'd have to believe that as Catholics. The more effort you put in, the greater the reward for you. We have to think, for example, about the Irish Catholics during the time of persecution. I mean, they would go into the middle of the forest for a mass rock, and I'm sure that God blessed those efforts. They couldn't go every Sunday, but they would go as often as they could. So this is an option as well. Now, there are some cons, though. Of course, spending a few hours on the road every Sunday is not ideal. But again, none of what's happening is ideal. We're not talking about, hey, you've got a Latin Mass in your town, and it's perfect, and it's wonderful, and traditional parish, blah, 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 blah. And, but still, go drive 3 hours, We're talking about a time where the Pope is trying to basically destroy the tradition of the church. This is not a fun time for Catholics. And on the one hand, on the other hand, it is a fun time because it's a pretty easy time to be a saint. To be a saint in the church today, you literally just have to hold on. And that sounds kind of, maybe I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm kind of serious here. To be a saint, is to exhibit heroic virtue. To die a Catholic in today's world in a state of grace, I mean, goodness gracious, you've got to demonstrate some heroic virtue. Just hanging on is a saintly thing to do nowadays. So on the one hand, is it an ideal time to be alive? Well, no. On the other hand, is it ideal? Well, it is, yeah, because it's a great time to become a saint. So, but the cons of this are, obviously, you are not going to have a community life. It's just not going to happen. I mean, if you're 2.5 hours away from your parish, how can you have a community life? You might be surprised. There might be a family that's somewhere near you, roughly, and they're going to the parish, and you meet them, and then, because people do drive pretty far for the traditional Latin Mass sometimes, but it's not a good way to have a community life, and that's not sustainable in some ways. So, it's not going to be a long-term solution. I would say that. So if you get in this position, you're going to have to consider moving. That's just how it is. But it is a temporary solution. Okay, so here's a combination. It may be, this is a solution that's a combination. It may be that there is a mission chapel within, an hour from you, maybe an hour or two, and you can make it some weekends. Maybe there's a private mass by a retired priest some other times. Maybe there's an Eastern Rite parish a little closer but still far away. I think Tim Gordon uses the term parish orphans. Maybe you're basically just a parish orphan. So, I mean, it's not, we're in a time of crisis where nothing about what's happening is ideal. That being the case, you got to get creative. Again, I mean, there are Canadians, for example, I know near the Windsor border, the Sarnia border. This is Port Huron and Detroit. The ones near Niagara Falls don't have to worry because the SSPX is there, and so is the fraternity. And that bishop is actually quite friendly to tradition. That Bishop Burgee, I think his name is. He's actually quite good. But there are Catholics in Canada who are, now that the mandate's still technically in place to get into the States, although they never enforce it. I've been over like 7 or 8 times. There are some stories at being enforced, but nonetheless, that's not been my experience. People are literally crossing the border to go to Mass. So, I mean, it is what it is. I actually think if you're living in the southern United States, I think there's a really good traditional Catholic priest in Tijuana, I think. I know it's kind of dangerous to go there, but I think I've seen some of his videos on the internet. I think he's pretty amazing. And he's like an old war dog. He's older now, but he was around during the council, and he's still got a parish and is a traditional Latin Mass priest. And I don't know, maybe that's why they sent him to Tijuana. Anyway. But the point is, people are getting creative, and people are crossing international borders to go to Mass. People are crossing borders of states and of diocese borders. They're driving 2 hours here this time, or finding a private Mass here. These are things you're just going to have to do. But I mean, if you've made the decision that you're just not going to attend the Novus Ordo, then these are the decisions you're going to have to make. So the pros and cons of these are the same things that apply to everything. It's a pro if you go to this place, and it's a con because of this reason, and that's just going to be a combination thereof. Being a parish orphan is not an ideal way to be. It's going to be difficult to make community life and stuff, but again, if you got lemons, make lemonade. You can make it work. Okay, this one is going to be the most controversial, I think, for traditionalists. Now, I want to be clear. I've never been to a Anglican Ordinariate Mass, but traditional Catholics that I really respect have, and they love it. And some traditional Catholics who I really respect have been to it and aren't huge fans. The reason I'm giving this as an option is because, well, it's reverent and it's not the Novus Ordo. And there are some places like down in Texas, I think in the Austin area, maybe San Antonio, where I think the Ordinariate's huge. And it's from all I've heard, is very traditional. I mean, it's very traditional theology, the liturgy everyone's receiving on the tongue and so forth. And it's booming because people are basically leaving the Novus Ordo, but there's not really traditional Catholicism around. People are going to this. I'm not a fan of the Anglican Revolution, and I don't think that we should be Anglicans. However, there are a lot of traditions from sort of English Catholicism that were kept in this Anglican tradition, and the things that are not Catholic have been pruned away. And if you talk to priests who switched over from the Church of England to become Church of Catholic or Anglican Ordinariate priests, they'll tell you that they were basically traditional Catholics in their heart for a while before they finally made the switch. There's one priest, Father Hunnick, I think you pronounce his name. I think it's spelled like Hunwicki. I mean, he's an Ordinariate priest. I was reading an article that he wrote about the life of Marcel Lefebvre a couple days ago, and he was calling him a great saint. So clearly there are traditional-minded, traditional Catholics within the Anglican Ordinariate, and it's been very helpful to some people. There's a huge emphasis on education within the Ordinariate. They're really great with doing schools. And, again, it's not in the cards. It's not in the cards for some people to move. It's not in the cards to drive 3 hours every Sunday. These things are not desirable at all. They're not good for family life. And if this is an option, then I just think that you have to at least consider it. And I'm not telling you one way or the other to do it. And I'm not even saying that, I'm comfortable with an Anglican Ordinariate thing, given my opinion on the sort of history of the Anglicans. However, again, I have to defer to the testimony of these really strong traditional Catholic supporters of the Ordinariate who have said that, it's the best thing since sliced bread in some ways. So I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there because this is an actual practical solution. And I know people personally who have talked to me and said, this thing was a savior. They were like, didn't know what to do. There was nothing for 5 hours in their state. And, the diocese is super liberal, and they're just like, what on earth am I going to do? I got kids, I got to raise them. And they said, I'm just going to try this Ordinariate thing, and they couldn't be happier. And it's a very traditional Catholic setting. So there you go. That's an option, okay? And that's something to consider. Okay, last thing, and this is the one that you don't want to have to do, and it is not a long-term solution. This is a Misasika. Now, what does this mean? Well, essentially what it means is this is a dry mass. That's what the word means. This is a last resort. There's nothing. You're up the creek without a paddle. And basically, in good conscience, you can't go to the mass nearby, or if there is one that you could even consider going to nearby, and you have to still sanctify the day. Basically, you go through the first half of the mass, the prayers of the first part of the mass of the catechumens, it's traditionally called. Say a rosary, listen to a sermon, and, that's what you do. Traditionally, this was done by families who were traveling, for example, back, it was normal back before the council. Excuse me. Obviously people took Catholicism a lot more seriously, and they would just do a Misasika as a family. This was something that happened. This happened a lot during lockdown. As I said, this is a very controversial option. I'm not saying this is a good option, but ultimately, if your only option is Misasika or James Martin doppelganger saying mass at your local Novus Ordo parish, the church says you have to go to mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation, unless there is some sort of impediment. And one of those impediments could be, you don't want to go to a terrible, scandalous, blasphemous, sacrilegious festival of sin and iniquity. These are situations people are facing. So if you're faced with that situation, you have no other options. This is a last resort, because ultimately the reason why the church says you're supposed to go to mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation is to sanctify the Lord's Day, which is the divine command. People have to understand the laws of the church. Law in general is only just or justly applied when it works for the good of the thing or the person that it's being applied to. We all know this. We know in our gut what's the difference between a good law and a bad law, or a good use of a law and a bad use of a law. I'll use an example I've used in other places. When they had that Freedom Convoy event a year ago here in Canada, obviously it was very controversial. Those of us who were sick of being segregated from society were pretty excited about it. In fairness, it was a raucous, uprising sort of thing, and that's not necessarily something you want to happen in your society in the long term. So law enforcement was trying to figure out ways to deal with the situation, and the federal government put the nuclear option and basically used, what amounts to something like, emergency power, wartime power. It was absurd. Everyone knows it was absurd. Even liberals knew that it was absurd. But the law itself wasn't bad. The idea of having that sort of power with the government for those sorts of scenarios, it was basically, hey, bombs are going off in Toronto and we don't have time to go through Parliament. I'm going to call the army in right now. That's just sort of very commonsensical that would exist. But it was applied badly, even though the law was good in theory. The same thing can happen with the laws of the church. It's not divine fiat from God. We're not Mormons who believe that the Pope is like some oracle, the head of the Mormon church, who can change the, matters of faith and morals. This is not the case. So the divine law is to sanctify Sunday, and the normal means of doing that is through the attendance of Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. And to apply the law in a way that actually harms somebody's faith is a misapplication of the law, and it's actually unjust. So if that's your scenario, that's your scenario, and no one else can make that decision but you. And if you can't attend the local Mass near you because there's some grave impediment, then this is where there are exceptions to positive laws, because that's just how law works. People want to disagree with that. Well, the same logic of how law works applies to church laws. It's not like some special category where we have to shut up our critical thinking. So there you go. Those are your options, ladies and gentlemen. And that's all she wrote for the slides. So if Pope Francis is going to take down the traditional Latin Mass, this is not something that we want to happen. If this does happen, it's not legal in the long run, but it will definitely cause some pain and suffering for a lot of people. These are 7 solutions. Let me know what you think in the comments, or if there's any situations that you have any questions about. I hope that's helpful. Please get the links in the description to go to the TKR store and support the channel. Thank you to everyone who has. And stay tuned for my SSPX book that's coming out hopefully within 2 or 3 weeks. So I keep pushing it back a little bit, but life is crazy and stuff happens, as they say. So this has been the Kennedy Report, and until next time, God bless.